is Charles Washington, and you're back with Zeroing In on Health, and this is the third installment of our video blog. Thank you for watching, and today we're going to look at a new headline. It's on dementia, and according to the latest news, our cases of dementia have risen at a staggering rate. More than 35 million people around the world are living with Alzheimer's disease or other types of dementia. The new count is about 10% higher than what scientists predicted just a few years ago, because earlier research underestimated Alzheimer's growing impact in developing countries. Barring a medical breakthrough, the World Alzheimer Report projects dementia will nearly double every 20 years. By 2050, it will affect a staggering 115.4 million people, the report concludes. The study goes on to say that while age is the biggest driver of Alzheimer's, some of the same factors that trigger heart disease, obesity, high cholesterol, and diabetes seem to increase the risk of dementia too. Those are problems also on the rise in many developing countries. The National Institutes of Health began funding studies for Alzheimer's research back in 1975. It took about a decade when researchers began to report that Alzheimer's actually shared the same risk factors as some of the other chronic diseases, such as hypertension, atherosclerosis, heart disease, and diabetes. All of these things, they shared a common risk factor, so therefore it's not beyond the pale that perhaps they could share a common cause. If coronary heart disease is a symptom of the metabolic disorder of high insulin, as the evidence suggests, this would implicate blood sugar and refined carbohydrates. A handful of studies have suggested that Alzheimer's is just another disease of civilization, with the pattern of distribution similar, if not identical, to heart disease, diabetes, and obesity. Japanese Americans, for example, when they immigrate to the United States, typically develop symptoms of Alzheimer's that are consistent with that of Americans. The incidence of Alzheimer's dementia in African Americans, according to research published in JAMA in 2001, is twice that of rural Africans, and they are 3 times as likely to suffer vascular dementia, again suggesting that dietary or lifestyle factors play a role in both dementias. Studies in large populations, 6,000 elderly subjects in Rotterdam, 1,500 in Minnesota, 1,300 in Manhattan, 800 Catholic nuns, priests, and brothers in the American Midwest, and 2,500 Japanese Americans in Honolulu have suggested that type 2 diabetics have roughly twice as much risk of contracting Alzheimer's disease as non-diabetics. Diabetics on insulin therapy, according to the Rotterdam study, had a 4-fold increase in risk. Hyperinsulinemia and metabolic syndrome are also associated with an increased risk of Alzheimer's disease. The Rotterdam investigators reported that the indirect or direct effects of insulin could contribute to the risk of dementia. Back to our report, it urges that the World Health Organization would declare dementia a health priority and for national governments to follow suit. It recommends major new investments in research to uncover what causes dementia and how to slow or stop it. There is no known cure. Today's drugs only temporarily alleviate the symptoms. Scientists aren't even sure what causes it. But major studies underway now should show within a few years it's possible to at least slow the progression of Alzheimer's by targeting a gunky substance called beta amyloid that builds up in patients' brain. This group that funded this study is pushing for an increase in U.S. research spending from just over $400 million to about $1 billion. So what is meant by this beta amyloid? What's going on in the brain that they're trying to stop? So this gets complicated because the underlying cause of dementia is exceedingly difficult to diagnose, even on autopsy. For this reason, it's possible the research linking diabetes to a higher incidence of Alzheimer's does so because it confuses the consequence of a complication of diabetes, vascular dementia, with apparently increased incidence of Alzheimer's dementia. Alzheimer's dementia is a slow, insidious process that can be identified on autopsy by the presence of neurofibrillary tangles, which are twisted protein fibers located within neurons, and amyloid plaques, which accumulate outside the neurons. But vascular dementia is a recognized complication of diabetes and perceived as more abrupt cognitive decline that is caused by small strokes in the blood vessels of the brain. Vascular dementia is usually diagnosed because dementia appeared shortly after a stroke or because the autopsy revealed the characteristic stroke-related signs of vascular damage. The vascular dementia is a complication of diabetes, means diabetics are far more likely to be diagnosed with it than non-diabetics. We all seem to get the tangles, and the amyloids of Alzheimer's due to aging, but only some of us seem to get perceptible signs of the full disease. According to Gary Taub's research, investigators have proposed that Alzheimer's starts with glycation, which is the haphazard binding of reactive blood sugars to brain proteins. Because the sugars stick randomly to the fine filaments of the proteins, this causes the proteins to stick to themselves and to other proteins. This would impair their function and at least occasionally leave them impervious to the usual disposal mechanism, causing them to accumulate in the spaces between neurons. They cross-link with other nearby proteins and eventually become advanced glycation end products. The theory is controversial, but the identification of advanced glycation end products in the plaques and tangles of Alzheimer's is not. The involvement of insulin in Alzheimer's can be considered the simplest and possible explanation for the slow, relentless development of Alzheimer's plaques in the aging brain. Normally, we have what is known as insulin-degrading enzyme, or IDE, which normally degrades and clears both amyloid proteins and insulin from around the neurons. The more insulin available in the brain by this scenario, the less IDE is available to clean up amyloid, which then accumulates excessively and clumps into plaques. In animal experiments, the less IDE available, the greater concentration of amyloid in the brain. Mice that lack the gene to produce IDE develop versions of both Alzheimer's disease and type 2 diabetes. The relevant research was conducted by Dr. Suzanne Kraft, a neuropsychiatrist at the University of Washington in 1996, and she held this particular opinion and she's not saying that this is the mechanism for all of Alzheimer's disease, but it certainly makes the hypothesis possible and would affect a significant number of people. Now, in view of this evidence, obviously researchers are looking for a drug that would somehow slow the accumulation of all these amyloid plaques. However, this research seems to indicate that it would be much easier just to tell people to stop eating carbohydrates and change those dietary habits that would cause less IDE to be available because of so much high insulin. So it seems to me if you eat foods that would keep your insulin levels low, then you would have more IDE available to take care of plaques that will form in your brain as a result of aging. Well, thank you for being with me for another installment on Zeroing In on Health, and this was Diabetes. Once again, my name is Charles Washington, and hopefully you'll come back next Wednesday for the next installment of our video blog.